So I was just listening to the entire 3 hours of LED Baker's coverage. Sorry, it's taken me a lot, but listening to Emily D. Baker's coverage of the Brian Laundrie, Gabby Petito estate civil lawsuit, that ended up also releasing that letter, that Brian Laundrie left. That there's so many holes. Like on a legal basis, there are so many holes. Alright, a few things I need to get pointed out. First off, the factor that apparently the case ended up going ahead and become public interest. Ultimately, does that end up going ahead and removing a right to privacy? Not to mention that, but considering that whole, the legal basis of, was he not expecting his body to be found? With his body being found, that letter being found on a person after killing himself, explaining that, after accidents ending, the submerging situation, like, apparently Mercy killed, then suicided. Alright, ultimately, the basis ends up being, alright, Florida has an interest in this whole situation, considering the factor that apparently the basis ends up being Florida. Alright, ultimately, what does Freedom of Information Act end up being able to go ahead and reveal, while at the same time, too, ultimately, just because of the factor that the public wants to end up being nosy in a situation, do they actually get the right to be able to sue civilly, during an investigation, to be able to try to get information that could end up leading to personal enrichment? Ultimately, when it comes to the agreement, when it comes to attorney-client privilege and, contractual obligation, especially when it ends up coming into the variable of estate law, and division of assets and antiquities, ultimately savings and, physical belongings and everything, especially since the dead cannot go ahead and speak up, ultimately going ahead and having the case ending up being in public interest. Ultimately could it end up being argued that with the lawyer going on the media, ultimately was that a form of, potential advertisement to go ahead and try to gain additional revenue to try to, bolster the, reputation, of the specific firm. Like, so many factors that end up coming along into that. Also that snowball effect, cause and effect, chicken or the egg, really how far does that end up extending ultimately when it comes to attorney-client privilege? Does the ignoring of, constitutional basis and constitutional rights end up going ahead and meaning that there should be no rights in the circumstance? Ultimately, if presumption of guilt ends up going ahead and being, being the only foregone conclusion that there ends up being to the public, despite the factor of, morality and perception in comparison to, personal, what I feel is right, in comparison to, well, this is viewed right in this specific culture, Because, ultimately, you end up having the extent, too, of, like, alright, if somebody's a shoplifter, understand, when it comes to, Islam and Hindu, In their culture, it's customary if somebody goes ahead to steal from you to go ahead and chop their hands off. Well, at the same time, ultimately, you know, you also have the extent too of, how much of this ends up going ahead and being Schrodinger's estate. And when it ends up going and stretching to Schrodinger's estate, how much of the legal theory of it ends up going ahead and having a basis to, El Chapo's safe, Do you remember with, who was it that ended up going ahead? That went to go reveal it, went to go have it opened up, nothing was in there, you know? That's the reason why, using legal theory and, Schrodingering it, based on moral perception in comparison to legal standing and precedence, ends up being so dangerous. Not to mention that, but ultimately, does attorney-client privilege actually go ahead and end up extending, if the client ends up going ahead and being dead? Ultimately, when it comes down to the circumstances of the waterlogging of the actual, letter, I mean, how much of it could potentially end up being the factor of, was it an attempt to go ahead and, rinse away any, oils or residues from any type of, fingerprints? There are so many things that need to get kept into actual consideration. And at the same time, this actually could have enough legal precedents basically to go ahead and destroy the capability for attorney-client privilege, which ultimately the destruction of that ends up going ahead and completely throwing off the balance of, the justice system in the first place, and ultimately ends up leaving the justice system into a predatory gladiator arena, especially when you end up throwing politics and religion into it, despite the factor of acting like religion is morality. Well, in the meantime, one of the biggest things that ends up going ahead and being put into question, was the Immaculate Conception. Ultimately, the Virgin Mary's husband was in his 30s, if I remember correctly, and she was actually in her young teenage years, and at that point it was customary because of the factor of, a shortened lifespan, to, have, people married off at an age of child, like pretty much as soon as the body was able to go ahead and start menstruation. So literally that ends up going ahead and put a legal basis on child marriage, and obviously that right there is a pretty dangerous normality, because at the same time, acting like it's a different time ends up going ahead and putting so much more, you know, that ends up going ahead and putting the ethicality and morality of that religious basis, and trying to go ahead and incorporate morality, you know, in comparison to legal standing. So, that being said, am I the only one that ended up noticing all of that? Like literally, that's not a slippery slope. That is literally like extending a slip and slide throughout the length of the entire planet.